Good morning. I'm Wade Markell. I work at the RAND Corporation. I work for Tim, and I work on the generating force. As an analyst, my job isn't to tell the Army what to do, but rather to tell the Army how much something will cost and what they will get for their money. Today, my topic is to talk about manning the generating force for reversibility. I'm not going to push a particular point of view on that, but rather just to highlight some of the issues that the Army needs to consider when developing courses of action. Could I have my first chart, please? Now, as the analyst out there will tell you, anytime you're going to do analysis, you have to come up with something fairly concrete. Now, I've tried to put as little as possible in concrete terms as I thought I could get away with and still get through this briefing. But today, for the purposes of our discussion, we'll consider reversibility in the generating forces consisting of two major aspects. One is substituting military for civilian manpower with a view for using those folks later on as cadre for an expanding Army. Now, you'll see up there on the chart there are three purposes to which you could put that additional manpower, and I put them up there because the purposes for which you use them will dictate the kind of manpower you want to keep and the places that you want to put them. Three things. Obviously, we all are familiar with the idea of using these people as cadre for future units. But the other part of this is that there are a lot of wartime headquarters, there are a lot of wartime requirements that pop up, and they pop up in every war, and we very seldom envision doing them before the war. I remember before this last unpleasantness, as people from the South might call it, that there was going to be no such thing as a sub-unified command anymore. Well, I think you at least have to acknowledge the possibility, not only for the sub-unified command itself, but for a rotation base with which to man it. Second, there are things that the generating force or the institutional Army does for the Army in the course of operations, and they're going to need uniformed people to do those things, to project those capabilities forward into the area of operations. Those are the thoughts that need to be kept in mind as we decide what kind of soldiers we need to keep, in what grade, in what quantity. Now, the other part of this is excess organizational capacity, and I'll just stick with one particular example, recruiting command. It doesn't do much good to have cadre if you can't recruit the soldiers for them to lead. Now, the thing is, all this excess capacity costs additional money, and that money in an era of limited resources comes from somewhere. I'm going to talk about it in a second, but eventually what you're doing is balancing risk. You're balancing risk that you're going to take in regard to your current emergencies in order to preserve capabilities to do other things later on. The reason you have to do this, and I'm sure you're all sick of hearing it, and you're probably sick of saying it, is that human capital takes a long time to grow. It takes 10 years to grow a decent major, although I'm sure there are folks out there that are capable of being majors in 5, 10, or even 1 year. But as a rule, it takes 10 years to grow a major. It takes longer to grow a good mid-grade NCO. It takes longer still to grow a battalion commander, and it takes almost 2 decades to grow a brigade commander. I don't know what the timelines are, how long it takes to grow a capable recruiting command, but from the people at RAND who work these issues, it can't be done overnight. The point is if you lose these capabilities, you can't reconstitute them in any magic form. You've lost them for a while, and it will take a while to reconstitute. May I have my next chart, please? Now, the thing is, as I said, you're balancing risk because you don't get this expansibility, this reversibility for free. What you see on the chart behind me and near front is what is called inside the Beltway the shark chart. And so I see General Formica smiling at it because he knows it and hates it. For those of you who don't already know it, I'll explain it to you in a little bit so you can hate it too. What this is a very notional depiction of the relationship between the demand for Army forces and the available supply under various conditions. And those conditions, more or less, I'm going to get myself totally confused, but going from left to right are what passes for peacetime in today's world, your military engagement missions, your occasional foreign humanitarian assistance and so forth, your peak surge events, what we always used to think of as the two near simultaneous major combat operations. And then something we learned to our great displeasure in 2003, 2004, the fact that some of these major combat operations have a long, expensive, and unpleasant stabilization phase or counterinsurgency attached to them. When you man the generating force for reversibility, what you're really doing is you're buying capability to execute that rotational surge. Because even if you've maintained that cadre, even if you've maintained that excess capacity in recruiting command and other similar places, what you don't have is a Marvin the Martian army, where you just add water and all of a sudden you've got fully trained and equipped units. It's going to take time to develop those units. Now, if you have foresight, if you have clear and unambiguous warning, you could have those units on hand for the peak surge. But as we've heard several times, we don't have a great record as far as anticipating that kind of need for it. So you're going to get those folks after the crisis, the precipitating event. You're going to have to pay to get that up front, because there's only, if you're going to maintain that additional capacity in the generating force, it's going to cost more money than you'd ordinarily spend, and there's only really one other place to get it. Now, there are other places, sure, you could mess around with modernization or something like that, but in the end, it all comes back to capability, your capability to do what you have to do right now or on short notice. I'd also like to highlight the fact that what you should be looking at doing when you're doing that are the kind of forces you're going to need for that rotation and stabilization phase. You could go chasing your tail and trying to retain capability to build that peak surge, but really, that's the forces you're going to need are going to be, say, your engineers, your military intelligence, perhaps even your transportation that you're going to need for the rotational surge period. In the end, what I'm trying to depict with this cartoon here, and I want to emphasize it's entirely notional, it's entirely a cartoon, is that you're balancing risk. You're balancing your current emergency versus what may happen in the future. Next chart, please. There are some other considerations to think about as well. I want to return to this issue of the leader development timelines being your constraining factor. Because if you can somehow figure out a way to reduce those timelines, if you can somehow grow a battalion commander in a third less time, that starts to change the whole calculus. Until that time, however, there are other leader development implications. Because if you're going to maintain these people as cadre, some of these folks as cadre in your generating force, you're going to have to afford them the operational experience they need to fulfill that role eventually. Again, that can only come from one place, and that is the folks you know you're going to want to use to lead the future Army, what used to be called the project warrior types, the folks who are going to serve in repetitive operational assignments to really develop excellence. Well, if you need to get everybody that operational experience, that's less of that for your project warrior types. Now, that could be a good thing. We've mentioned broadening already. That will afford them the opportunity to pursue broadening experiences. Now, as you picked up, when you start to think of cost and risk, you tend to get kind of gloomy and think of everything as a downside. But there is a potential upside as well, because now all of a sudden, in your generating force, you have a pool of operationally experienced manpower that are also acquiring skills in the generating force. That can allow you to better man the train, advise, and assist missions that you're going to have. There's a twofer there. I'm going to finish this thought. That's also an advantage because a lot of our potential partners really need help with their institutions. When there were problems in West Africa and the Nigerian army went in, they initially did very well, but they started to have problems not because of their problems exchanging gunfire with the West Side Boys, et cetera, but when they stopped being able to pay their troops in an expeditionary mode. So this could be a good thing. It's also a good thing because if you're drawing folks from the generating force, you're not having to render operational Army units incapable and thus unavailable for your peak surge. In some ways, you may be able to buy back that risk I told you about earlier. Finally, the last thing I'm just going to highlight is the fact that the generating force only has a limited capacity to absorb this additional military manpower. Now, some of you who know the numbers are going to look at me like I'm crazy. There's several 100,000 civilian billets in the generating force. But the problem is there may not be a match between the skills and grade that you want to keep against future operational requirements and the skills and grade, even in their rough civilian equivalents, that you need to have to run your generating force from day to day. In the end, as I said, I'm not here to push a particular point of view. This is definitely a viable means of being able to buy back capacity that you otherwise couldn't get. Ultimately, however, it is a question about balancing risk. How much capability you want, how much future capability you want to buy for how much current capability you want to pay. And with that gloomy thought, I will conclude the panel and remain open for questions.